Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
A couple weeks ago, maybe a month ago, PayPal inserted something into its user policy. You know, these things that nobody reads, you just click to say, I accept, so you can go ahead and use whatever the product is. The wording in there, and what's interesting is PayPal does not deny that the wording was there. They do claim that they're backtracking on it, but here's the thing. The wording in this use policy said that PayPal will fine users $2,500 for spreading misinformation.
Who gets to decide what misinformation is?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of mischief that hangs on that question. What's happened is people had a tizzy and PayPal came back and said, no, that was a mistake. That language should never be in there. It took it out, so it's not an issue. However, it starts me thinking about corporations and the First Amendment. I've long been a proponent of First Amendment protections applying to corporations because corporations are simply collections of people. If people have First Amendment rights, they have them, whether they're walking down the street or working in a company or whatever it is they're doing. But here's the question that now bothers me. Does it work in the other direction? The First Amendment, the freedom of speech, applies when there's government action. If there's no government action, then there's no First Amendment question. But what do you do when you're dealing with a company that holds tremendous sway over you? So we're talking about PayPal here, but let's suppose it's not PayPal. Suppose it's your bank. And your bank says, if we catch you spreading misinformation, we're going to close out your accounts. You're not protected under the First Amendment because there's no government action here. But should companies be allowed to do that?
The First Amendment begins, Congress shall make no law, not PayPal shall have no ridiculous policy. I didn't even know that PayPal had pulled this because apparently I was fast asleep the day they did it. But what ended up happening was I see all this brouhaha over whatever it was that PayPal did. And don't you know, they backtrack immediately as a result of all of their customers losing their minds. The customers are going to have to say, look, you guys are out of your minds.
Yeah, and I agree with all of that. I just have this nagging problem in the back of my head. What do you do when it's a company that you can't easily get out from under?
I think you have to stick with the same principle that brought you in the door, right? That if that starts happening, it won't be long until another company shows up looking to earn your business. I've got something completely different this week. You've been watching the real estate market heat up, and it got to this crescendo not too long ago, and then home prices, it's like a race to the bottom. It's like the entire market has just been gutted. And you start to realize that had to happen because mortgage rates went from under 3% to over 6%.
Yeah, like overnight.
Yeah, they doubled, and they doubled rather quickly. And when money gets more expensive, houses get cheaper because people only have so much to spend. And from where the purchaser sits, it doesn't matter if their money is going towards principal or interest. It's their money leaving their pocket. I think we've got something that it's going to probably start approaching a housing crisis.
Yeah, I wouldn't at all be surprised.
Second one in recent memory.
The housing crisis now is 20 years back, maybe 15 years back. It seems to be the case that every generation, people have to relearn basics of economics. It's like we're starting from zero.
And here we are, right? People are saying, how can I lose? Well, hang on a second. The markets will tell you all about how you can lose.
That's right.
I remember during the dot-com bubble, a friend of mine looked me in the eye and he said, I just bought TSDO. He didn't even know the name of the company. And I said, really? What does that company do? He said, well, I don't know, but how can I lose?
Yeah.
A few months later, he was down $68,000. It was almost all of the money he had saved over his entire life. Here we are again with people saying, I'm going to buy another house. How could I lose? For the foolishness of the week, I want to go to Herschel Walker. Herschel Walker was one of the greatest running backs I ever saw. When you put the ball in Herschel's hands, you knew it was going to take 5 men to take him down. He was just a beast of a man on a football field. And then he decided he was going to run for the Senate in the great state of Georgia, where his past starts to become a bit of an issue. Turns out that he gave a check for $700 to a former girlfriend, who the girlfriend claims it was for an abortion. But Herschel, of course, says it wasn't. He doesn't say what it was for. We get to figure out whether conservative Republican types in Georgia actually care about the thing they say they care about. In this case, abortion. All the anti-abortion people should be anti-Herschel Walker people.
I think this is the thing for politicians in general. Look, their primary goal is to win the election. So it doesn't matter whether they're Republican or Democrat. They're going to say whatever it takes to attract what they perceive the voters to be.
And I don't know who could look at him and believe it.
Who's the guy that said you could tell when a politician's lying because his lips are moving?
That's been said so often, I have no idea who said it first. But that's not wrong. What they want to do is win, but it's never saying something like, this is what we believe, and if it costs us a couple of votes, well, so be it.
The idea of principle seems to be gone. You and I and many people have used the sports analogy that people have come to think of politics as sports, and I have my team and you have your team, and all that matters is the team wins. And I used to think of that as an analogy, but I don't think it's so much of an analogy. I think in a lot of cases, that's actually what it is. People just want their team to win.
If you take a look at how the Republican Party drifted from Reagan's time to right now, it drifted hard. You would be hard-pressed to name a thing the Republican Party believes in right now that was also the case in 1982. And I've made no secret, I have no respect for populists of any stripe. If you're going to take the temperature of the electorate and say anything that you can that might make them happy, well, I'm not interested.
To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. If you'd like to support Words and Numbers, make your way over to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers, where you can contribute to our podcast-making habits. If you'd like to schedule us to come speak at your event, be it corporate or educational, or have James officiate at your wedding, send us an email at wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com. For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. This month, the world is celebrating the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. I thought this is a good time for everybody to sit back, take a deep breath, and take stock of what's happened with poverty worldwide over the past couple of hundred years.
Income inequality, wealth inequality, these aren't going to be hanging out on this particular day, is that right?
Well, it turns out I think they are going to be hanging out on this particular day. Worldwide, we've been solidly winning the war on poverty. So much so that now, at least in the United States, they use the word poverty when they really don't mean poverty at all. They mean inequality. As poverty does indeed become eradicated, you can shift gears and start talking about inequality, and that never goes away. Doesn't matter how rich everybody gets, somebody's going to be richer and you're going to have inequality. So that's a problem that never leaves us.
Well, we might say that that's not a problem.
Well, yeah, assuming you want to call it a problem. But let's go back to poverty for a moment. I've seen data that goes back to the 1700s. Most of the data I've seen goes back to the 1800s. What you find is that the world poverty rate, and of course these are estimates, you have to estimate them best you can based on data that's spottily kept going back that far. But it seems to be the case that the world poverty rate in the early 1800s was around about 90%. 90% of the world lived in poverty. And when I say poverty, I'm using the UN's definition here. Their definition for extreme poverty is living on less than $1.90 a day per person, and that's adjusted for differences in costs of living. Think about that. 90% of the world living at that level. There's all kinds of things you can say, like, well, but if everybody's earning $1.91, technically nobody's living in extreme poverty, and that's a reasonable counterargument. However, what we can do here is look at this metric over time, and you can argue whether 190 is the right number, some other number is the right number, but if you look at the metric over time, you can see very clearly the number of people who fall below that line has been falling precipitously. We're down to less than 10%. In fact, the last number I saw, which would have been for 2021, the world poverty rate was around 8%, and that's 8% given that there was a significant uptick in poverty due to COVID.
Right.
If it hadn't been for COVID, we'd be at 6% right now.
So when I get all hostile about the $1.90 figure, well, in the end, we need something to use as a before and after point.
You're right.
From that perspective, why not $1.90? This allows us to see how things move over time.
And so we're at this really both strange and wonderful place that 200 years ago, almost everybody, and by almost everybody, I mean 90% of the world, lived in extreme poverty. And today, it's 8%. And we did that despite the fact that there are 10 times the number of people on the planet today as there was in the early 1800s.
This is the showstopper. People are coming out of extreme poverty, and we're getting a massive uptick in human population.
Yeah.
You might tell them about Malthus, because he was completely wrong.
Now, Malthus was writing back in the, early 1800s. I read about Malthus at the same time that this data set is beginning. And he's looking at the time, an exponential increase in world population.
Population boom.
Boom is probably the wrong word. It's more like a population nuclear explosion, combined with 90% of the world living in extreme poverty. And he says, oh my God, if this keeps up in another generation, half the planet's going to be dead of starvation.
People who want to sound the population alarm, they always say the same thing. What we have now is tenable. What we will have in a year is untenable. And what will happen? We will not have enough food to go around.
People keep repeating this, and I know some pretty intelligent people who keep repeating this. And I ask for the evidence. Show me the evidence. And what I get is hand-waving about, well, maybe poverty's down, but the environment and blah, blah, blah. And I don't have a strong position one way or the other when it comes to environmental stuff. It's not my area. I can't speak to it with any more authority than any average person on the street. However, I do note a similarity in Malthus and people like him back in the day saying, oh my God, the world's ending because of extreme poverty, and being able to point to these numbers, and the numbers, given his information at the time, were absolutely correct. And yet he was wrong. And I see the same kind of sky is falling thing coming, not in all quarters, but from a lot of quarters with regard to climate change. Is it a big deal? I think so. Is it going to mean that we're all going to be dead in a generation? I tend not to think so.
I tend to doubt that very significantly.
But the best I can do is point to Malthus and say, look, once upon a time, we thought that the world was going to be gone in a generation. What happened then is something came along that Malthus never anticipated. And I can't help but think that there might be something at play here as well, or at least I could say I hope there's something at play here as well with regard to climate. The thing that Malthus in his time never anticipated was the unprecedentedly massive increase in productivity. That all of a sudden we went from, and I forget the exact numbers, I'm going to make this up, but what I'm making up is not far from what I think the numbers actually are. We went from, in the 1700s, a farmer being able to support 2 people, maybe 3 people, to today where a farmer can support 10,000 people. All of that because of tremendous increase in both our capital stock and our technology.
We went from a number of people on the earth living barely subsistence lives to a greater number of people on the earth, exponentially different number of people on the earth living in absolute comfort.
Yeah.
Malthus wasn't wrong. He was completely wrong.
He was spectacularly wrong. If there's a foolishness of the millennium,
that's right.
I think Malthus kind of qualifies. A criticism people have made to me in the past is when I've quoted these numbers, and why I started quoting these numbers back when the world poverty rate was maybe still 15% or just coming down to 10% thereabouts. And people would say to me, okay, well, maybe the fraction of people living in poverty is declining, but the absolute number of people living in poverty is going up. In other words, there are more people living in poverty, although the population has grown more than the number of people living in poverty. So the fraction is gone down while the absolute number has gone up. And indeed, that was the case up until around, I'd say, plus or minus 2010. And then that number turned around. And now year by year since then, not only is the fraction of people living in poverty going down, the absolute number of people living in poverty has been going down.
So no matter how you look at things now, poverty is becoming a thing of the past everywhere.
The numbers are so overwhelming in that direction that if you wanted to go in and twist the numbers to match your perspective, you couldn't do it because the numbers aren't cooperating anywhere.
I suspect they could do it, though, because I'm almost positive what you're going to see is that poverty is disappearing almost every place. But in the few places it's not disappearing, you're going to have more and more and more people in that category. Poverty's not disappearing in North Korea.
I think what we'd find if we looked around is that in geographic places where the poverty is going up or not going down, we should be able to point to reasons as to why that's happening.
And as I think about poverty, literal poverty around the globe, it's authoritarianism. I'm thinking about North Korea. I'm thinking about Venezuela. You start seeing a pattern there.
And you see this if you look globally. If you start to ask the right question, I think the right question is, what is it that is bringing people out of poverty? There are two general answers. One general answer is government intervening and actively taking steps to eradicate poverty. And the other, government stepping back and letting markets eradicate poverty. We've got a couple of examples here that I think are compelling. On the one hand, we have the United States. Since 1967, when we started our war on poverty under Johnson, we have spent, adjusted for inflation, around $23 trillion fighting poverty in this country. And our poverty rate in this country has remained a pretty constant 13%.
Isn't our poverty rate a function of numbers that we all agree on, numbers that we declare?
Yes, that's correct. So we define our own poverty rate in this country, which is, I forget what it is, like $10,000 a year or something.
Right, but might it not be the case that no matter what, we always have 13% poverty because we keep redefining the level?
I don't think that's as much of a thing. Now, we adjust it for inflation, which one should do.
No, I'm just saying it could happen.
Oh, it could happen. Yeah, I don't think it is happening here. It could. I take your point.
Because if next year we eradicated poverty, I'm pretty sure that politicians would redefine poverty.
Let me come back to that because there is an instance in which what you're describing is happening. It pops up when we talk about inequality. We'll get to inequality in a minute. But when it comes to poverty, generally speaking, that poverty level that we set in this country, we'll adjust it for inflation, but that's pretty much it. It's been a pretty constant definition. And yet, we remain with this 13% poverty. And despite the fact we spent $23 trillion adjusted for inflation. Look, there's an alternative here. You don't think I'm serious about it, but I really am. That for the same $23 trillion, we could have cut a check to every poor person for $10,000 a year, every year since 1967. By our own definitions, it would have completely eliminated poverty in this country.
But the reason I know that that's not a serious possibility is that we don't know ahead of time what the figures are. It's not like in 1967 we could have said, alas, we will spend $23 trillion and it won't work. If we knew that, we would have done something else.
That's fascinating, James, because I think you're right. And I also think that if we could go back in time to 1967 and say to Johnson, look, you're going to spend a total of $23 trillion adjusted for inflation, he'd first drop dead of a heart attack. And then when he's revived, would say, well, then forget it, because clearly that's way too much money. It's not worth fighting that war.
But there was no way we could have said, let's opt for this better option.
No, that's correct. There are practical problems here. But my point in raising this thought experiment is to show that if we haven't done that, if we haven't eradicated poverty for the $23 trillion we spent, it probably can't be done that way.
Yeah, that's right. I'm more than happy at this point to admit that poverty has gotten the best of us, and we probably need a different approach.
Yeah, and that takes us to the other approach, which is using markets. And when I say using markets to fight poverty, it's less a matter of actively fighting poverty than it is raising people up. One of the things that markets do well through entrepreneurs is find untapped resources and bring these resources online, make them productive so that they're bettering everybody. And in bettering everybody, there's profits that ensue, there's income that ensues. And while it's difficult to picture exactly how that would happen, And it has to be difficult because it doesn't happen on a directed one-size-fits-no-one model. It works with individual entrepreneurs and individual investors and individual consumers throughout the economy making their own individual decisions. But if we look at countries that are more economically free and compare them to countries that are less economically free, and you ask, what are your poverty rates in these two countries? You find remarkable difference. So take the 100, whatever it is, 200 some countries of the planet, divide them into two, the more economically free, the less economically free. The poverty rate amongst the less economically free is on average 50% plus for the less economically free countries. For the more economically free countries, on average, it's less than 15%. It's a gargantuan difference. Now, there are exceptions to this, but generally, you can point to markets and say at least markets are showing some marked result here in fighting poverty, as opposed to our $23 trillion that hasn't managed to budge the poverty rate since 1967.
People should just be able to look around and see this. I don't think we have to recur to data to prove this point. Anybody who's traveled at all knows what's going on.
One of the things that I think has been happening as we eradicate poverty, and let me give you one more comparison that goes to your point, James. A $7.25 an hour job, full-time in this country, earns $15,000.
Right, this is minimum wage.
Yeah, not just minimum wage. This is the federal minimum wage. So forget about the fight for 15 or whatever it is. $7.25 an hour, full-time, that'll earn you about $15,000 a year. Adjusted for differences in cost of living, the average income on the planet is like $12,000. We've become so rich that a $7.25 an hour full-time job in the United States is what the rest of the world calls a middle-class income.
And if you put another person in that house also earning minimum wage, all of a sudden that household is at the global 1% level.
All of a sudden, you're incredibly rich from a global perspective.
It's not difficult in the same way that other lives globally are difficult.
On the one hand, I'm saying $7.25 an hour is a middle-class income for the rest of the planet. On the other hand, I'm saying our poverty rate has remained at 13%. The fact is we have defined poverty in this country to be an extremely high level of income versus the rest of the world. But what has happened over time is I think the narrative in this country has shifted. We've stopped talking about poverty, or let me say this differently. We continue to use the word poverty, but we actually don't mean poverty. People will say relative poverty. What that means is inequality. And that seems to be where the focus has been in this country for the past decade or so, on income inequality instead of poverty. And that's a no-win scenario right there, because you can have a country in which the poorest person is a millionaire and the richest person is a trillionaire, and you're going to have inequality. And people can say, look, there's inequality here, and what do we do about that? But the fact is, your poor person in this inequality is incredibly rich. So on the one hand, I don't want to ignore questions of inequality. On the other hand, I do want to keep them in perspective. If we're talking about inequality where the unequal people are poor in a real sense, yeah, that's something to be concerned about. If you're talking about inequality where the poor people are actually rich in a real sense, I'm not concerned about that.
And here's where I think we have to drive the point home a little bit. Inequality of a certain kind is simply not a problem.
Yeah.
If we have reasonable equality of opportunity, that's good enough. If we're dealing with human foibles, you're just going to have to write off a certain number at the end. You're going to have to say, look, we've mostly done away with, well, in this instance, inequality. We have the institutions in place that address that problem. Now, if you don't want to avail yourself of those things, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I have to admit that it's kind of all nonsense when you take a look through the lens of mental health. This is a mental health problem. And if you got that solved, the other two, the inequality and the poverty problems, would just simply disappear.
That's interesting you say that, because I'm drawing a parallel. In this country, we attempt to fight drugs as if it were a criminal problem when in fact it's a health problem. And so too here, we tend to fight poverty in this sense as if it were an economic problem when in a lot of cases it's a mental health problem.
Yep, that's right.
And you just end up bringing the wrong tools to the job.
That's exactly right. They might be great tools, but they're not going to work here.
One thing that I had known at one time and I had forgotten, and one of our listeners brought it to my attention recently. I'm going to tread a little bit lightly here because I have not looked at the data I'm about to talk about. However, I'm going to talk about it because I have seen this claim from multiple reputable sources. So put a footnote here on what I'm about to say. But the thing that I have seen from multiple reputable sources is that when we calculate income inequality in this country, we do not take account of taxation and transfers. That is, we ask the question at a gross income level, so income before taxes and transfers, what kind of inequality do we have? And we come up with this metric and we say, here's the amount of inequality. We completely ignore the fact that we have a progressive tax system. Contrary to what you might hear, the rich do pay more than the poor. In fact, they pay a lot more than the poor. And it doesn't end there. The government then cuts checks to the poor in a variety of ways, from the earned income tax credit to income assistance to housing subsidies and on and on. But all of that, the taxation of the rich, the transfers to the poor, mitigates inequality. But we don't measure that. And so when people say, look, inequality in this country is not improving, well, yeah, of course it's not improving because you aren't measuring what we've done after we've attempted to fix it.
I find it to be quite horrible that in a place like the United States, where we're doing very well, that there are still people who aren't doing well at all. Do I think that we should somehow cover all of their shortcomings? Yeah, I don't think so. And that's going to yield a condition in which you will always have a certain kind of poverty in your midst. I guess I have to be okay with that.
And I would put a footnote there because there are some people who can't work for whatever reason, be it physical, be it mental. Those sorts of people you always have with you. And I think it's incumbent upon us to do something there to help them. But then there's another group of people, and the problem is you can't always distinguish who they are, but they exist, who say, look, I don't feel like working. I don't want to work. And all the better if you'll give me a check for not working.
Right. I think we've got three groups at least in poverty. And I think we have to care about two of them. How much we have to care is a political question, so I offer no answer. Decent people take care of people who can't take care of themselves. How you do that, well, that's another question entirely, and that's a question for at least one other episode, maybe 50. On that happy note, Ant, I think we're done here.
Happy International Day for the Eradication of Poverty.
That's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next week when we talk about something at least a little more uplifting than this has been. Until then, join us at Words and Numbers Backstage, where the conversation continues. Follow me on Twitter. Don't bother with Anthony. And what am I missing it?
Send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
I said, what was I forgetting? Not what was I omitting on purpose? And I haven't said this a lot lately, and I think as I watch the news nightly, you see how the world is plunging into disrepair. I think this is partially my fault, and I will remind everybody that you should be nice to each other. Even if it hurts a little bit, you should be nice to each other. Why? Some things are good in and of themselves. Ant, I'll catch you next week.
See you next week, James.